very heartfelt issue in this land and across Europe. So it's wonderful to have Ben back. We were trying to work out where we first met. We either first met at Clare College in Cambridge when we were on a panel talking about Christian perspectives on the EU, or we were at Winchester University on another panel discussing Christian perspectives on the EU. We still don't know which, but we were at both events. It was Christian perspectives, and it was the EU. I was Gary Wilton, and he is Ben Ryan. So it's very lovely to welcome him to All Saints as we think through what might be a Christian perspective on immigration after Brexit. So Ben, welcome back.
Thank you very much indeed for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to talk a little bit about ethics and immigration and a Christian perspective on ethics and immigration. And I'm going to say right up front, my kind of warning for this is I don't really anticipate that anyone will necessarily agree with me at the end of it. And I don't really care. My purpose is not particularly to make you agree with me and more to kind of try and change some of the way in which we think about the purposes behind immigration. So with that in mind, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to start by trying to lay out the context of immigration. Everyone has a view on immigration. Everyone has an idea of how they think the immigration situation is playing out at the moment. The first thing I want to do is try and strip back some of perhaps what you think you know and give you the stats on where we are at the moment. After that, I'm going to push through and argue that what we need to this is an ethical perspective. And I don't want to be misunderstood on this. People think ethical means nice. It doesn't. There's nothing in the word ethical which necessarily means nice. It's simply the process by which you arrive at a moral decision. And my argument is that what we need is a better way of coming to our decisions than the one that we've used so far. But the British approach to immigration has been muddled, badly muddled for a long period of time. And in fact, most of the West has had a very muddled approach to how it thinks about the ethics of immigration over time. I'm going to then pause for questions, and then I'm going to put forward my possible model for a Christian ethical model, not the Christian ethical model, but a Christian ethical model for how we might think about this going forwards. But before saying all of that, it's worth saying one thing. I wasn't pro-Brexit, and I have concerns to some extent about the way in which that might play out in the future. But if you're talking about opportunities after Brexit, sorting out immigration is the big one. You really are facing a scenario now coming out of the EU in which the UK government really could pick any policy it wants. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really have the discussion about how immigration works and how the UK government should deal with it. What's been a bit disappointing so far is that there hasn't been a lot of imaginative thought about, well, really anything. The fact that we're still thinking about how to fix the Irish border, this is the tip of an enormous iceberg of decisions which have yet to be made. But when it comes to immigration, you really could have anything, from complete open borders through to an absolute closed border in which no one at all could be allowed in under any circumstances. All options really are on the table. And my point is only really that it would be a tragedy if there were not a Christian ethical perspective put forward into that debate. Never, ever, ever leave things to economists, is my rule. You must lie. But let's start with the context. You probably can't see those numbers. Don't worry, I'm going to read through most of them anyway. In total, for the year ending March 2017, there were 588,000 people who arrived in the UK. That was the total immigration number. That was 50,000 lower than the previous year. So on the whole, immigration is actually going down year on year, as far as we can tell, for at least the past 2 or 3. Of that total, so just under 50% of the total, immigrated to work in the UK. So they were economic migrants, people who moved here to get a job. In fact, 188,000 already had a job. They were moving within a company, they were moving for a definite job offer, they came with a work placement already guaranteed. There were 16,000 people, just over, who were granted asylum, resettlement, or an alternative form of protection, so refugees. So that is 3% of the total immigration number only were refugees in that period. There were 139,000 students, and that was 27,000 lower than the previous year, but 139,000 people who moved to the UK to study. And at the same time, emigration, so people who left the UK, was at 342,000, which was bigger than the year before. Now that means that your net migration, the total number of people who came in, minus the total of people who went out, was 246,000. That's the difference. That's the total number of people overall that are in the UK this year that weren't there the year before. That's the sort of total scale that you're talking about. Just about half of the total that came were from the EU, the other half were from out of the EU. 70,000, who count towards the immigration figures, were actually British. So if you're a British citizen who goes to live abroad, and you move back, that counts as an immigrant. So you go into the figures. So 70,000 of them were those. That's the total. And that sounds like a very big number, and indeed it is a very big number. Although, of course, many of them have no intention of staying. So your students, for example, 139,000 students, almost all of those are going to go home, about 95%. But that's the scale we're talking about. It's interesting to put that into international perspective as well. Worldwide, there are around 240 million people who live outside the country of which they were born. That's the highest number there's ever been in human history of people who live outside the country in which they were born. It's about 4% of the total world population. Interestingly, it was also 4% of the world population in the 1950s, and it was in 1900. The number has stayed the same, it's just the world's population has got that much bigger, and where they've moved to is different. It used to be that Europeans moved elsewhere, now other people are moving to Europe. But worldwide, the proportion is about the same. That's the context. It's not necessarily very helpful in telling you anything about what that means in practice. What does that mean economically? What does it mean socially? What does it mean in terms of our ethical response? But it does give you the kind of overall framework. And what it does raise is two critical ethical questions. The kind of lens through which you apply this when it comes to migration really comes down to two questions. The first question is essentially, who do you let in? Under what circumstances should someone be able to move to the UK? What rules do we put on that? Who gets in and why? And the second big ethical question is what's required of them once they arrive? So once you're a migrant who's arrived in the UK, what is expected of you? Are you expected to learn the language? Are you expected to pay tax? What are the kind of rules governing people once they're there? Those are the two kind of really major ethical questions which we're wrestling with. And how you shape your answer to that is critical for your overall approach. The great problem with the British approach is that it's been completely muddled. Throughout history, since at least 1950, the British have had two completely different criteria by which they've thought about how you judge the success of migration. And the two are not the same. They're not even necessarily compatible. The first is about economics. So the argument goes, migration is fine, immigrants are good, as long as the economic benefits outweigh the economic costs. And that's the first kind of major criteria which is put forward. And you see that in various places. You may remember during the Brexit referendum debate, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson suggesting an Australian-style points system for migration. This was their big idea for how we'd do migration after Brexit. Interestingly, that's not actually that different from what the UK already has for non-EU migrants. We already, in fact, have effectively a points-based system. We already have a shortage occupation list. But the idea of this policy is that you basically look at what the economy needs. If the economy needs more nurses, you say that people who are nurses get more points than other people. And in this way, you work out a system which says immigration can be good as long as it meets the kind of economic benefits that we want. In the same way, you will see various pro-Europeans who talk about the economic benefits of migration in terms of, for example, what they do to pay into the system. their taxes, their contributions. There are various models you can use, which some would say at least demonstrate that the Polish community pay a lot more into the British state than they take out in terms of, for example, benefits or use of the NHS. That's not necessarily true of all migrant groups, and it does actually depend quite a lot on how you run your sums, but it's certainly an argument. And on the negative side of that calculation, you'll get people who are saying, well, what about the economic costs of migration? And that's usually seen in terms of the costs to institutions. So what strain is put on the NHS, or what strain is put on schools by having high levels of migration? This, again, is an economic argument, saying not necessarily that migration is good or bad, but that it's simply a sort of weighing up of costs. I do think one of the kind of ways in which this plays out, which is a bit more, to me, ethically concerning, is when you see people who rep themselves as a left wing. And I'm thinking of people like Jamie Oliver, who come out with this trope about lazy Brits versus hard-working migrants who will do a job for a lot cheaper. That's a horrific argument, I've always thought. This idea that it's a good thing for us that we can kind of exploit people to do work which no British person would possibly want to do because it's so badly paid and horrible. But nonetheless, it's an argument which you see kind of brought out from time to time. The other criteria is about integration, and it's completely different. So if the first argument is just immigration is not good or bad, it's just what can we afford, what's the benefit for the economy, the second one is what extent do we cause people to integrate? So the success of migration is judged by how well people have become British, effectively. And I remember the Norman Tebbit cricket test, which he raised in Parliament, this idea, what team would Indian or Pakistani origin people support in a game between England and Pakistan? And his argument was that this was problematic because he thought they would all support Pakistan. In fact, the evidence is they tend to support both. But nonetheless, it's an argument which is made, and it's an argument which is twofold. It's firstly, how do you get people to become British? And what does that mean? So firstly, you kind of almost need to define what it is to be British. And secondly, how much can you enforce that? So the polling says the majority of British people want migrants to learn English. The question is, do you insist that they learn English? Is that something you'd like, or is it something that you enforce, and that you make people go to classes, and if they don't, they're not eligible for benefits or something else? That's a very different approach to meeting the same criteria around integration. But note that those two criteria, your economics and your integration, are not remotely the same thing. And the example for this is a Russian oligarch living in Knightsbridge. That person drops a lot of money into the British economy, huge amounts. Whenever they go to Harrods, they buy loads of stuff. Economically, this person is a success story, but not integrated. Don't learn the language, don't claim British citizenship. Is that an example of successful migration or unsuccessful migration? And most British governments have oscillated between the two. Sometimes they've been all about the economics. They go all down the Boris Johnson, Michael Gove approach. It's fine. As long as we meet the economic criteria, the rest can follow. And the other half go very heavily down this integration route. We need migrants to become more British. We need them to integrate fully. They're not the same end, taken to their logical conclusion. Both of them are also based, you might notice, completely on a criteria of what is good for the British state. In neither of those criteria is there a concern about what might be best for the migrants. That's a kind of left-out hole in the middle of these debates. And you might say, well, that's fair enough. I mean, the British government is elected to represent the interests of British citizens, and of course, that is true. But it does raise that question around what does that mean for your kind of definition of what it is to be a human person, that your whole identity, your legal status, and your rights are decided by where you were born, and that isn't something that you can change. So if in principle you decided tomorrow, I don't like being British, that's not my thing, I don't agree with the British government, I don't agree with the British state, I just don't want this anymore, you don't have the right to just get rid of that. You can't just move to another country and say, I'm French now. I subscribe to these French values, this French identity, I don't feel British, I feel French. You can't do that. The only thing that you can do is move to France under whatever rules there are and then go through the process of applying for French citizenship, if that's allowed, and in some countries it isn't. In the same way, people moving to Britain might try and integrate, but you say, well, that depends really what criteria we give you, but your passport is what defines who you are in legal terms, internationally, which is why refugees are so vulnerable. If you're from a situation in which your state decides that you don't belong to them anymore, then you become uniquely vulnerable because there is no force out there protecting your rights. There's no force protecting your status. And I think that does raise questions in Christian ethical terms about what that means in terms of dignity, in terms of status. We can see this, though, more broadly. I think that there are 4 ways in which most Western states have tried to think about migration. 4 solutions that they've tried to bring in. Sometimes they've used more than one, sometimes they've tried to use all 4 at once, totally unsuccessfully, but they're the kind of 4 big tactics. And what you'll note is that every single one of them is completely bound by what's in the best interest of the state, rather than the migrant, and all 4 of them raise at least potential Christian ethical problems. So the first one is multiculturalism. And this is often characterized as a policy in which you just let everyone live together. You provide no kind of means for genuine interaction between groups. You just say, you sort of absolve yourself of responsibility. You simply say, there are migrant groups, there are British people, fine, they can do whatever they want. In fact, that's a bit of an overgeneralization of the policy that was enacted under Tony Blair's government. It's an exaggeration of what happened in Canada, but that's the kind of broad accusation towards it. And the issue that you might have with that ethically is, does that policy ever meaningfully build solidarity? If you don't ask groups to interact with one another, if you don't do anything to kind of encourage a process of communication, if you don't encourage people to become more British, do you ever build community? Do you ever build a kind of strong solidarity within a country, or do you simply create ghettoization? Do you just have groups living literally alongside each other but not with each other? There's a Catholic theologian called Thomas Halleck who has a really interesting take on this. He thinks this is the classic liberal trap, that most Western states have completely misunderstood what Jesus meant when he said, love your neighbor. When Jesus said, love your neighbor, Halleck says most Western states have taken that to mean tolerate your neighbor. Just let him get along with whatever he's doing and you get along with whatever you're doing, and as long as he's not doing you any harm and you're not intervening, no harm, no foul. And Halleck's point is that's not what Jesus was saying at all. Jesus' command was far more radical than that. It was about loving your neighbor, an actual interaction with them, an encounter, not just tolerating them. So that then leads us to the second big technique, which is the Markhit state. This is linked to what I've already said about the kind of British vision of just reducing everything to economics. And effectively with this one too, you reduce everything to what's in the best interest of the market. And this too, I think, raises serious questions and challenges. For example, let's say you've got Boris Johnson's dream comes true and you bring in this points-based system and you encourage people to come in to fulfill a particular job. What happens if that worker decides they want to stay in the UK? They've made friends here, they've got married perhaps, they've built a life here. At what point do they stop being the worker and start being a person? What happens if they want to bring their family over? What happens if they want to move job, or they decide they want to retrain? Do you kick them out? Do you change the rules completely? How does it actually work out in practice? It becomes possible to create a situation in which you see workers, migrant workers, simply as this kind of exploited second class of citizen, people who are just brought in to do a kind of economic function and then get lost. The extreme end of that is what you see in most Middle Eastern economies. So the Middle East, we think that, I think often that economic migration is a thing which happens to the West, it happens to Europe. Actually, it's much higher in lots of the global South. So if you look at Middle Eastern countries, by the early 1980s, foreign workers made up 70% of Kuwait's workforce. So fully 70% of all the people working there were not from Kuwait. It was 81% in Qatar and 85% in the UAE and 75% in Saudi Arabia. All of them brought in just to work with no effective rights. It's effectively a kind of slave indentured economy. Now, obviously, no one is proposing that for the UK. But in saying that, you still have to recognize, well, if we're not saying that for the UK, then we are recognizing that there has to be a certain level of rights. Well, what level? And who underpins them? And how do you make sure that you're not just creating this underclass of exploited people? There's also that danger, which is inherent in a lot of kind of Christian ethical approaches to this, about turning people into nothing but commodities, just labor, just bits for the economic machine. And that, too, is a kind of dehumanizing vision. Pope Francis said a lot on this, including that this is a real, he talks about the prevailing mentality which puts the flow of people at the service of the flow of capital, resulting in many cases in the exploitation of employees as if they were objects to be used, discarded, and thrown out. And that's all we make of people. And the line of Pope Francis is that's not what being a human is. That's to strip human dignity from this approach. A third approach is around assimilation, and this is, again, is linked to that integration point. It's how you make people become part of the country. If multiculturalism is just letting them get on with their own thing, assimilation is making them become British. And there are various things that you see in there. Compulsory language tests are becoming much more common in many countries. Oaths of allegiance are much more common in many countries. In the US, you start every school day by reading out the Oath of Allegiance. There is no evidence that that helps to increase integration, but nonetheless, it's an increasingly popular policy. It might be something to do with dress. So when you see the French banning the bikini or things like that, that's a kind of forced assimilation, a kind of movement using the law to kind of change things. And the balance which there is, how do you stop that becoming oppressive? And how do you stop it from being a system which doesn't work? And how do you make people want to do it rather than just do something because they have to? And the fourth tactic is around security, securitization. And this is, again, treating migrants from a perspective of state interest, but it's saying that you treat migrants purely from the basis of whether or not they are a security threat as a group. So the classic example would be Donald Trump's executive order, which stops all migration from Iran and Yemen. Is that logical? Not strictly. There's nothing to suggest that every Iranian is necessarily threatening. To give a kind of counter-example, almost everyone who's ever been convicted of insurance fraud is a white man. No one has ever suggested that we ban white men from becoming insurance salesmen. That kind of blanket approach to a problem is rarely a totally logical one. And of course, we all recognize the state's got a duty to protect citizens, but again, it's how do you do that without dehumanizing and blanketly approaching a whole group as if they're the problem en masse? So that's 4 tactics to control migration to protect state interests, and all of them raise ethical problems. Multiculturalism doesn't seem to provide you with the kind of solidarity that you would want within a culture. The market state dehumanizes people, makes them into commodified labor. Assimilation runs that risk of being oppressive, and also doesn't match with the economic priority, usually. Securitization, again, dehumanizes people. All of them come with at least potential ethical problems. And all of them are really about assessing what migration means for states, rather than from the point of view of a migrant. And that, too, I think, raises ethical questions. And in a moment, I will tell you what I suggest. But I said to Gary that I would stop halfway so that we could do questions at the halfway mark as well.
Set us off with a great set of issues and questions. Do you want to talk to your neighbour for a minute? What has struck you so far about what you have heard? What do you need to hear more about? Where is your brain hurting? What have you just learnt? what has just been clarified for you, or what question have I not just proposed that you're thinking about? Talk to your neighbour for 2 minutes. Go. We'll give them a couple of minutes to get going. That's really clear, really clear.
Can we pop one on? Can we go one further? Yeah, please. And then when I start speaking, you can switch. And when I start speaking, if you can switch over to the next one.
Okay. Questions, comments that you would like to make? We'll take 2 or 3 or 4 at this point, and I'll collect them up whilst Ben is thinking about them. Questions or comments? Who's going to go first? Tim, just here. We have a new sound system. We're still working out which buttons to press.
Thank you for that. I've got a question about your response to recent comments made by the head of the CSU in Germany, who essentially was talking about a view that he holds that Muslims will never be part of German identity. They could only ever be Christian because of the historical origin of the country. And I would just like your reaction to that and where that might fit into your framework.
Thank you. That's one question, stroke comment. Who's going to go next? Oh, thank you. We've got 2 on this side.
I am an immigrant.
Could you just a little bit higher?
Sorry. I am an immigrant. As I've pointed out to somebody, I came here utterly amoral, not speaking your language, not having any intention of speaking your language. I was born abroad because your country, the United Kingdom, had colonies. My father was in the army. I listened to some of the stuff, and quite frankly, I reject the idea that, as the noble Lord Blunkett pointed out, I don't speak English. I don't understand British values, laws, and customs. I had to learn all sorts of things because although I am British, I didn't grow up here. I grew up in a country other than that. And one of the dangers, I think, about this is that we're conflating passport identity and migration status. You have given an excellent analysis, but you need to be fairly careful because people like me exist, and I'm really grateful that you pointed out that 1 in 25 of the world's population live in countries that they weren't born in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're going to go straight to Roger, and then we'll collect up one more question or comment after Roger.
I suppose it's only a small point, isn't it? But the heading on the screen above you is the Western responses. There's at least one word missing, isn't there, from that title, which is the Western governmental responses. How do we relate to what governmental responses are in terms of our daily life? I don't think, on the whole, any of us as people in the street, so to speak, go around saying that. And what's my multicultural approach to this today when we encounter somebody or something? So I'd be interested in how you explore that.
Great. One more question or comment? Who's going to go for it? Speak now, or ever hold your peace. Right, Ben, do you want to take those?
Yes, thank you. I'll start with the first one. I think that's a hugely interesting question. And it's very much the case here as well. That's been a kind of long-term debate. Can Muslims become British? Is there something about kind of an Islamic identity which is incompatible with a British identity? And you see that played out in many other places. Several things to say on that. The first is that it is interesting to note that historically this question gets asked again and again and again of basically every latest migrant group. So there's a fascinating study which someone did which looks at newspapers from the 1880s and their reactions to the Irish and compares it to how newspapers talk about Muslims now. And other than kind of the fact that people's language has changed a bit, the ideas are basically the same. These people are ill-suited to democracy. They have a religion which is very kind of top-down, which is very demanding of them. They have sympathies with foreign powers, some of whom are enemies of ours. They're never going to integrate. They live in ghettos. These were the same sorts of things which were said then. So the first thing to say is that, that can change. It can take a long time, but then you can end up with someone like me with an Irish surname like Ryan, having a posh Surrey accent and being considered to be English. That process is a difficult one, and it's not to be blasé about it. It's not to say there are no challenges in integrating Islam into various of these national identities, but it is to say that historically there are precedents for this. And also on that, I think there's a very interesting thing more generally about identity, which is whether you take a kind of reductive approach, where you kind of say, this is the core of what it is to be British or German, and that's it, or whether that idea itself is mutable and can grow over time. There's a French poet, philosopher, Valéry, who's got this kind of idea of Europe as Hamlet, and Hamlet's going around picking up skulls, and he's having a sort of existential breakdown, because Valéry is writing just after World War I. He's seen the horrors of the kind of result of Europe's going to war, and he's saying, well, I've got all these skulls, they're all kind of great European figures. Can I get rid of some of them? Can I get rid of Hitler and still be a European? Can I get rid of Nietzsche and still be a European? Pick your evil figure. They're all kind of there historically. And the question is, how many more can you add and still be part of what you originally are? And I don't think there's a real answer to that, or certainly not one which has been worked out. But what I would say is I think that's a kind of ongoing conversation which there's a lot of Muslim groups which are beginning to think about that and beginning to think about how you do kind of British values from an Islamic perspective. So that would be my response to that one. The second question, I completely agree with you, and I think there's a really interesting distinction to be made, which I'm going to talk about a bit, about whether we see citizenship and status as an issue of the mind or the soul, which are kind of two different things, where one is kind of, this is the sort of rational understanding, this is a kind of legalist point of view, I'm here, and because I'm here, I'm owed certain rights, and I appreciate that intellectually, and this is my kind of mental approach. And there's one which is kind of soully, which is about belonging, and where people sit on that spectrum when it comes to an issue like citizenship, I think is huge. And it's where you get all these debates about when does someone become British. There was a Conservative MP I saw who got himself into a kind of endless and unproductive Twitter fight over the status of the cricketer Moeen Ali. Moeen Ali plays for England at cricket. He's from a Pakistani background and considers himself to be English. This MP was saying, well, really, I think he's British, not English. Well, Moeen Ali thinks he's English, so who's right? Who gets to call someone English? Is it the person whose status it is? Is it a kind of subjective personal assessment? Is it something which the rest of the group has to agree on? That is a question which, again, hasn't really been worked out, but I think it's where the fault lines lie. Part of it is in that subjective thing, and part of it is in that mind versus soul. And just on the last point, it's always difficult to look at kind of community responses to immigration because it's so difficult to do research on that. It's so difficult to work out what you mean in different settings. It's easier actually on refugees because there are lots of kind of social action community projects which look specifically at refugees, and you can work through, well, how are people doing community resettlement and things like that. When it comes to the broader issue of migration, it's much more difficult. I'll give you an example actually from Sweden. They did some polling in Sweden where they asked the question, would you like this person as a neighbour? And that was the question. There were a set of options, and they included a homosexual, a Christian, a black person, an immigrant, and various other options. And what was interesting is Sweden is a kind of robustly liberal country, and everyone said they were okay with almost everything, except Muslims. 95% of Swedes said they were fine having an immigrant as a neighbour, but only 60% were fine having a Muslim as a neighbour, which was a really interesting kind of example of where the kind of break point in that kind of national psyche was coming in. But that's the kind of research you can begin to do. And there are so many questions which that poses. Why weren't you happy with that? What's the difference between immigrant in general and Muslim specifically? Why did that kind of breakdown in dissonance happen? And of course, there are lots of obvious answers to that around kind of terrorism and things, but I think there's a deeper question there about, well, how do we respond in practice to people as well? In principle, we say we're fine with having all these people next to us, but what does that mean in practice? Do we do the Halleck thing? Do we just tolerate them? Or do we love our neighbour? Do we go and engage with them? Do we invite them round? Do we actually have conversations? That would be a really interesting piece of research to be done about actually, well, how do people interact with their neighbours from different backgrounds? I don't think it's been done yet. It would be interesting to see. Right, I'm going to carry on. So, can we switch forward? And another one, please, actually. One more. So what do I kind of suggest then? Well, first off, I want to suggest that whatever happens next, whatever the UK does next, it needs to have a coherent value structure. We need to get past the muddle and decide on actually what is our ethical approach to migration, whatever that is. In a sense, there are various ways you could go down. You could say it's all about the money. It's all about the GDP. It's all about the economics. I was talking to someone earlier who works for an organization called the Social Markets Foundation. And he was saying there's a whole group of economists who say that we should be encouraging immigration, but only of the very poorest people. Because that makes the biggest difference in terms of GDP. If you take the absolute poorest people and get them to migrate, then overall the benefits are such that the GDP really rockets. Whereas if only rich people move, it actually makes no difference. Which is great if you're an economist in a classroom, and nonsense to everyone else, because that would be just about the least popular policy you could possibly bring in. But it's an argument. It would be a consistent ethical approach. You could make it all about maximizing social cohesion. You could say we will justify our migration policy only on the basis of what is popular or what is sustainable for building British communities in different places. And again, you could make that your entire stance, or you could go down a kind of libertarian route. So in that sense, you ask the question, who is anyone to tell you that you can't move? Why can't I just show up in France and say that I'm French? Who is this government to tell me that I'm not? And that, again, is a route you could go down if you wanted to, but of course none of them are necessarily compatible. Well, my model is based on 3 principles, which could in fact lead to a number of different policies, but there's 3 overarching principles which I think ought to be brought through. The first is that whatever we do needs to be a humanized model. The second is that we need to rebalance the relationship between rights and responsibilities. And the third is that we need an idea of the common good, and one which goes beyond state borders. So on that first humanized model, I think the first and critical principle for any Christian model is that it must approach the issue of citizenship, the issue of migration, from the simple position that those people who are involved are human beings, imbued with human dignity. And that simple message is absolutely critical to any authentically Christian approach to it. Christian anthropology, our idea of what it means to be human, rests on the principle that all people are made in the image of God. That could mean various things, but amongst others, the equal dignity of humanity is established in salvation, the fact that salvation is not limited to any race or creed. the special status of humanity, that all humans are made in the image of God and have special status, has demands on how we treat people. It has a demand that we recognize, if you like, the image of God in others. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to treat everyone exactly the same, but it does mean that at the very least you have to recognize something of their human dignity. And as such, the reduction of human beings to being nothing more than economic units, just fuel you put in the economic machine, is, I think, an affront to the idea of human dignity. I don't think you can do it. In place of the recognition of humanity, those approaches of the market state in particular tend towards what I think is an almost idolatrous obsession with economic progress at the expense of human dignity. Pope Francis, again, is excellent on this, but one of the things which he said in Evangelii Gaudium is that the worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. The worldwide crisis affecting finance and the economy lays bare their imbalances and, above all, their lack of real concern for human beings. Man is reduced to one of his needs alone, consumption. And his point there is precisely that we need to recognize that people are not simply economic units. I think that takes on a particular importance when you look at refugees, albeit that I've said that refugees make up only 3% of the total number of immigrants. They take on a disproportionate number of the coverage and a disproportionate amount of the concern. And one of the things which I think is interesting in that is that increasingly we treat refugees according to an economic criteria. What can we afford to take, for example? And that also that we've increasingly built a system which, when it comes to refugees, seems designed to kill agency. So we create a narrative which divides refugees into good refugees and bad refugees. Good refugees, says this narrative, are people who sit in the camps and wait their turn, wait to be processed, wait to be kind of people who take services from us. Bad refugees are refugees who try and jump the queue, people who take their own decision to try and get across the Mediterranean, to get into a country, to try and help themselves. In almost no other setting do we design a policy which says that the people who don't show any agency or initiative of their own are the ones who are rewarded. We strip out that element of human choice and agency when it comes to refugees. And that, I think, is a kind of curiosity of the system. There's a chapter in the book which we have coming out by an academic called Anna Rowlands, which discusses the way in which increasingly governments use destitution and poverty as a way of controlling refugees. They force them into particular means to try and cut out any sort of agency. And that, again, I think, is an unacceptable approach. But even beyond that conception of human dignity, I think there's something to be said about a Christian notion of what it means to be a person. We are very used in the modern world to thinking about people as individuals, as if that kind of a man actually is an island, operating as sort of atomized, single, rational actor. That underpins most of our economics, this idea that we assume that people are rational individuals who operate in their own individual best interest. In point of fact, as any psychologist will tell you, most humans are decidedly irrational and do things for all sorts of irrational reasons, around family, around loyalty, tradition, what other people think, and others. I think the thing which Christianity would add into that is an idea of the person. When we say that people are made in the image of God, we can mean various things by that. But one is that we don't think, within a Christian anthropology, that human beings are individuals. We think they're persons. And the model for that is the Trinity. In the Trinity, you have your three persons who are not single individuals, but are persons who can only exist in relationship to each other. And in the same way, the argument goes, human beings are relational. They are hardwired to be in relationships and communities of one another. They can only reach their own fulfillment through relationships with others. What does that mean in the context of migration debates? Well, I think there are two things that you could take from that. The first is that the idea that you can assume that you take in an individual is flawed. You don't do that. Whenever someone comes to this country, they come with a network of relationships and seeking to build those relationships. There will be partners that they make either there or that they have back home, which are an important part of their identity. There is a question about family, and that shouldn't be stripped out from them, because to strip that out from them is to strip out part of their humanity. But it also means that you have to take very seriously the concerns of communities who say that they are changing too quickly, that too many people have arrived in a place, and that this undermines their community and their relationships, because that too strips out something important about relationships and community, which is important to the way in which we run. That doesn't give you necessarily a clear policy position, but it does give you a sense in which you have to say, whatever we're doing with migration has to bear that model of what it means to be human from a Christian point of view in mind. Which brings me to the second point, which is around rights and relationships, which is how you work that out in practice. Most debates about citizenship, who gets to become part of a place, come down to a clash between a communitarian approach, which stresses the need for responsibilities on citizens, ask what you can do for your country type thing, or an individualist approach which stresses a rights model. Because you are from a place, you are imbued with rights, which are supported by the state. And those are the two kind of poles of it. I think there was a really interesting example of this recently in some of the press coverage around the Brit Awards. I don't know if you saw that. There was a lot of coverage around the artist Stormzy, who used his performance at the end of this music award ceremony to criticise the government, and specifically to criticise Theresa May for her response to Grenfell Tower. And this provoked debate in various ways, but one of the things which came out was an article, which I think was in the Daily Mail, which was suggesting that this was wrong of him, this was so ungrateful of someone who was from a migrant family which had been brought into the UK, which had been given a life far above what they could have expected in the previous country, to be criticising the government for their response. That's quite a common critique. It's the point that you hear quite often, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you go home? And it exposes a mindset which says that, in a sense, migrants are required always to be simply grateful for the opportunity which has been provided with them, regardless of how difficult their lives might be or how wrong something else might be. That's one end of it, but on a broader level, you see this in debates about contribution. So, for example, benefits tourism is the classic example here. Why do people get angry when people come from abroad just to use the NHS, is the question. Most people are angry about that scenario happening, but why is the question. Why does that annoy people? And I think the answer to that is because although people acknowledge that the NHS is a free service at the point of delivery, it is still funded by people who've contributed something to the state, in tax, in national insurance, in whatever other way have contributed something to the system and therefore are eligible to get something out from it. And what annoys people is the idea that someone cannot contribute and still benefit from it. And that's where the anger comes in. Of course, that raises various follow-up questions. How much do you have to contribute? For how long? Under what circumstances? Before you're eligible for what? After all, children don't pay any tax, but no one is suggesting that they shouldn't be eligible for the NHS. Only 1/3 of British people pay income tax, because most are either too old, too young, or don't earn enough. They obviously pay other taxes, but nonetheless, you see my point. When we talk about contribution, it's not a kind of straight-up equation. The more you contribute, the more you get. It's more subtle than that. The question then is, well, what does that mean for migrants? What level of contribution do we expect? And what are the responsibilities which rest on someone who comes to the country? And the flip side of that equation is, what rights do they get in return? What status is a migrant due within a British setting? So earlier I brought up the Middle Eastern model, and as I stressed, no one is suggesting that kind of Saudi model, at least I hope no one's suggesting, that Saudi economic model for the UK. But if we're not suggesting that, that does suggest that we do want some employment rights for people who come as migrants. And we do want some protections being placed upon them. And then the question is extent. How much and supported by who? And that's the question to be answered, and which hasn't been answered at all, really, in the context of what's happened after Brexit. There have been various guarantees offered to current EU migrants, but the exact status of what will happen to future people has not yet been worked out, and ought to be. The advantage of a rights model, of really emphasizing a kind of set of rights which are guaranteed by some sort of international system, is that you avoid the danger of everything just being about state interests. If the argument is that the best thing for the state is to increase the amount of money it gets out of someone at the expense of their rights, the way in which you protect that is to have a right structure which doesn't let people do that, which takes the state out of the equation. The danger of that is then you say you've got to actually give away power. You need to have a UK government giving power to some other court to hold over it. Not likely, given that you've just had a referendum to take back control, but nonetheless, it's the kind of idea which might underpin that. We do already have models for this. There are various UN human rights treaties to which we sign up to. It's not that the UK is inherently hostile to the idea of international law. It's how we might work it out in the future. And interestingly, there's quite a strong Christian basis for a more rights-based approach, and in particular on the topic of migrants. So in the Old Testament, you have a fairly well-developed set of rights for gerim, sojourners, people who've moved to Israel and Judea. Among other things, there's a clear prohibition against abuse of foreigners in Leviticus. There's a call for equal treatment before the law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. There's a call for those who've been integrated into the community to be included in feasts and festivals. The last one is really interesting, because that's not just saying that someone is due some rights, it's saying that you actually have to involve them in things to do with the national culture. It goes a step further than the kind of minimalist rights approach that we might expect. There are dangers in overemphasizing that. One of the things I was saying earlier in relation to one of the questions is around this mind and soul thing. Human beings are body, mind, and soul, and in the same way, many of these issues of identity are related to mind and soul. If your mind is the kind of rational thing, these are the rights I am due because of my status, intellectually, this is where I am, how does that differ from the question of the soul? This is where I belong, this is where I am seen as belonging. Those are two different notions of how you match up someone's citizenship. And again, we've never really broached that. In our citizenship tests, we don't ask the question, do you feel British? That's one question which is notably absent among all the questions about whether you can name the various kings, is there is no actual question about whether you feel as if you're British, which we might suggest is something of an oversight if that's what you think is important. Just as rights have a really strong Christian pedigree, so does that kind of notion of responsibilities. Cardinal Vincent Nichols is very keen on the idea that there is a Christian word for citizenship, and it is solidarity. It is a notion of having to contribute something to where you are. But it's not a matter of taking, but of giving. And that leads me to my final principle on which we might begin to form a policy, which is, given this difficulty in rebalancing the scales between rights and responsibility, if rights are only defined according to the state, there is that potential contest between, well, actually, are the interests of the state going to simply be more important than the interests of individuals? How do you protect human dignity in that space? I would suggest that the only really effective way of guaranteeing those rights and guaranteeing a Christian conception of dignity is a more extensive rights framework underpinned internationally. I doubt that it's possible, but I think it's the one which would best guarantee it. And this can be overstated. We should note that although the Old Testament has all these very firm rules about what you do with sojourners, it doesn't ever suggest full equality. So, for example, if you were a gerim, if you were a sojourner in the land of Israel, you couldn't become king. That was explicitly written into the rules. There are various things which you weren't eligible for, but there were others that you were. you don't, in a sense, have to go the whole hog and just say that anyone who comes is immediately given full citizenship. There are things you can do, but there is surely an argument for increasing them in certain settings. And equally, those responsibilities need to be emphasized and encouraged, and that can be helped. We call on migrants to seek the welfare of the city, in those words of Jeremiah, to help them to integrate. But there are ways of doing that without being forceful about it, ways which are encouraging, and a rights framework might, in fact, help that. I also think, as I sort of move towards a conclusion, that one of the things which that raises is that question of who is my neighbour, which is asked in Luke. Jesus' answer to that question is to give the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's all sorts of ways you can understand the parable of the Good Samaritan. One of my colleagues has written a book on all the ways in which politicians have understood the parable of the Good Samaritan, which goes right through to some slightly tortured explanations from one or two politicians. My favourite is Hilary Benn, who invoked the Good Samaritan during the debate about whether we should bomb Syria. David Mitchell, the comedian, had quite a good article on this, which said that it's quite a robust exegesis of the Good Samaritan, that not only do you help your neighbour, but then you find the people who beat him up and bomb them to pieces. It possibly goes a bit beyond what was suggested in the parable. But however else you understand that parable, what seems to be incontestable is that neighbourliness goes beyond the bounded community. Jews and Samaritans were different peoples, and that care of responsibility, that necessity of recognising the human, necessarily transcends that. And so I would suggest that that has to be the core of any new approach to migration. It has to humanise rather than making people into commodities. It has to commit to the idea of contribution to the common good and the need for migrants to work to that end, but which also increases and guarantees rights within that place. That's a model which would take very bold political leadership, which, frankly, I don't think we have. But it's not impossible that we might have in the future. So just to sort of conclude, what I've tried to do, and I said at the beginning, I don't really care one way or another if you agree with me on my ultimate kind of policy solution. But what I would like is to force a conversation in which we say, however we're going to approach migration policy in the future, what is the Christian ethical core behind that? How do we get beyond the muddle of past policies which have just dismissed things as either economic or integration questions? There must be something more to add to that within Christian thought. I wanted to get a bit beyond the question of refugees. I think so much Christian ethical work on migration simply focuses on refugees. That's immensely important. I also think it's quite easy. Most people agree in principle there needs to be some sort of asylum policy. It's much more difficult to make the argument for why we need an ethical approach to economic migration. And so I hope to kind of broaden that debate out. If you're interested in anything that I've said, I'm about to finish with an absolutely shameless plug. In a month's time, April the 19th, we have a book coming out which is called Fortress Britain, Ethical Approaches to Immigration After Brexit. It's a collection of essays. What I've said is based roughly on my chapter, but there are 7 within it. Different politics, different Christian approaches, but all of them surrounding this core of how do we have a Christian ethical approach to migration going forwards. And if you want to know more about that, I'd be very happy to sell you one or to explain it further. And again, if you want to know more about Theos, my organisation, which is a Christian think tank, again, do just ask me, and I'd be very happy to let you know about that.
Ben, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Please talk. Yeah, okay, I think you're going to have a first round of applause now. So again, you've got a couple of minutes to talk to your neighbour. How do you want to challenge Ben? What do you want to take away from this conversation? What question did you come with that he hasn't answered? What question are you going to go away with that you didn't even know existed before you came tonight? So have a couple of minutes talking to your neighbour, and then the microphone will go round as per normal. Go. Really good. So if you've got Okay, the microphone's going to come around in 30 seconds. So, we're ready. We're going to start. So we've got our first hand here. So again, we'll catch up, put 2 or 3 or 4 comments or questions, and then we'll go back to Ben before we do the next round. Welcome.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, but one thing I don't think you've mentioned is racism. I'm also a migrant. My mother's German. I was born in Germany. I didn't choose to come to England. My father was American of French descent, Cajun, so I've got First Nation and African heritage a little bit as well. And I think, racism has a very powerful impact on how people integrate or how they don't. And my whole time at school was ruined by being called Nazi all the time. And even as an adult, that's happened to me. I've been told to go back to where I came from, but I didn't even choose to come here. I didn't even choose to come here. And having, lived most of my life in the south of England, I moved here 3 years ago, and of course now I'm an incomer on top of all that.
Join the club,
and,
yes.
and when I went to study day at Mirfield, one clergy person told me, well, you have to be 60 years you have to live here for 60 years not to be considered to be an incomer, and I'll be dead by then. Somebody who, Hector Franklin, who was working as a priest in Chapeltown here, he's written in the African-Centered Review about racism and what it says in the Bible about that, and it's something that we're asked not to do. And I think that's a very important point which you didn't mention at all.
Thank you. We'll land that one. And we'll pick up a couple more. On this side, David Heckle, please. David is a personal friend to Ben, so you can,
For now.
at the moment, he may
My
not be
heckle
after
earlier
tonight.
was going to be, Ben, who do you support in the rugby? But I know the answer to that. He supports Ireland. He's very happy. No, my question is, people often talk about sort of Britain as not being as Christian a country as it was in the past. I was just wondering, sort of based on your knowledge of history, do you think that in the past this country did show more sort of Christian thinking and rationalization with regards to its immigration policy? And also sort of extending that, are there any examples from other countries around the world, potentially more religious countries, who do show an example of sort of incorporating religious thought or ideology into their immigration policies?
Thank you. We'll pick up a couple more, or we'll just do one more at this point. Who's going to go next? There is a question out there, I know it is. Thank you to Rob, please. Hold it very close, as though you can nearly lick it, but please don't lick it.
Surely one of the problems about immigration is how you tolerate differences between different groups. I wonder what the kind of secular world are going to think about as Christians telling the rest of the world how we should live together when we're not really very good as Christians. If you think of how many different Anglican denominations there are nowadays, we're not great spokespeople, are we really, for how to tolerate difference?
Just some easy ones to start off with, Ben.
I'll start with the last one. I mean, one of my relatively recent research projects was about ecumenism and the work of different churches in trying to get together to do work. And I think you're obviously right. But there is that, in a sense, Christian theological hypocrisy, that you're called to be one church, and yet we've got, I can't remember how many thousands are officially listed by the World Council of Churches now, but it is thousands of them. The question, I suppose, there is, well, what, in a sense, what do you mean, though, by that being a poor model? I mean, in a sense, isn't that quite a good model? That you've got lots of people who disagree on almost everything, but are still working together on lots of things, and are still recognizing, mostly, each other as Christians, even if they don't recognize much more than that. In some ways, that seems to be not a bad model. I mean, the most interesting kind of example that I think, there's an organization called Christians in Politics, which has 3 chairs, who are respectively the head of the Conservative Christian Fellowship, the head of Christians on the Left, and the head of the Liberal Democrat Christian Forum. And together they kind of get together, particularly around election time, to encourage Christians to show up and vote, to kind of promote campaigns in that area, but from different kind of places on the political spectrum, and indeed, in at least two of their cases, different places on various theological spectrums, but are working together quite constructively. And I think there's a point there, which is that when you say that we need to integrate people, that's not quite the same as saying that everyone needs to be the same, needs to believe the same, needs to be the same. It's asking for a recognition of dignity in the other. It's asking for a level of kind of responsibility and working towards collective solidarity and the common good. But it's not about collapsing your identity down so that you kind of dismiss any differences between you. And in some ways, I do think that Christians have been a bit better at kind of modeling that than most other groups, with obvious unfortunate exceptions. But overall, at the moment, that's a reasonably healthy place. And there's an interesting argument there too about, well, what's the church doing to integrate migrants? And I think the evidence on that is mixed, but there's something to be said. I'm a Roman Catholic, and my church is in South London and contains at least 20 nationalities in the congregation. It remains one church, it remains one congregation. You'd say there probably aren't many institutions which can claim the same, but they've got 20 different nationalities who come together in one place collectively for a kind of common purpose. There aren't many other bodies in the UK which can claim that. Football clubs, maybe. But, there aren't very many. On the second question, Britain as a Christian country is something which I've always thought is a really interesting argument, because what does that actually mean? Does that mean that everyone in it is Christian? Does it mean it's some sort of intellectual basis? Does it mean some sort of spiritual basis? What do we mean by that? This was, of course, one of the many things which got David Cameron into trouble, was he used this line that Britain was a Christian country and immediately got a letter from Richard Dawkins and loads of other humanists saying, no, it isn't. And the reason they'd fallen out is the humanists had all taken that to mean this is a country which is defined by Christianity and continues to be Christian in terms of who people are. And David Cameron meant it in a much woollier sense, that it's something in the kind of origins and the bloodstream and the intellectualism and the kind of morality of Britain. And in a sense, I think probably both actually had a point. If you look at the data, more than 50% of people now say they're non-religious. Certainly the number who call themselves Anglican is down about 18%, I think, of the UK population. It's not, it's relatively a small cut of the pie. What does that mean in terms of policies? Very variable. I think, as with what I was saying about the Good Samaritan, politicians like to lean on the Christian aspect of their policies when it suits them, and to abandon them when it doesn't, which is why you can have, for example, Gordon Brown and Margaret Thatcher both using the parable of the Good Samaritan to reach completely different political endpoints. Where for Margaret Thatcher, the Good Samaritan meant that what we needed was for people to do it for themselves and to let their neighbours do it, and you didn't need a welfare state. And for Gordon Brown, it meant the absolute opposite. It meant that being a Good Samaritan was really sort of putting money into the welfare state, and you can reach those positions with both of them quoting the same thing. With that in mind, when you look specifically at immigration policy, there have been times when people have explicitly said that they're invoking a Christian basis. After World War II, there was an example of that. There were various migrant groups who were welcomed in, and it was phrased in terms of the Good Samaritan and others, but it hasn't been systematic at any point. But the UK has kind of lived out what it would be to be a kind of Christian approach to migration, and I can't think off the top of my head of any European country which has phrased things that way, to be honest. And on the first question, was John racism? You're right, of course. That's one of the often the kind of elephant in the room when you talk about integration. Is it's fine to say that migrants should integrate, but what about people not letting them, or not wanting them to, or putting up barriers to that? That, of course, is an absolutely massive challenge. And I don't have a kind of easy answer for you on that, other than to say that I think there are examples of doing it well and of kind of promoting campaigns which have worked in that. And there are certainly examples of where it's been done badly, and where, in effect, kind of racism has been, if not encouraged, then at least tacitly permitted to happen, which have undermined efforts at integration. I do a lot of work at the moment with the Polish community, and there's interesting stuff there about that. Actually, until very recently, Poles were pretty popular as immigrants go, according to the kind of league tables of what the British think about different immigrant groups. There was a tipping point, and I'm not quite sure what caused that tipping point, but about 4 years ago, Poles went from being one of the most popular immigrant groups to one of the least popular immigrant groups. And I couldn't honestly give you a diagnosis for why that was, but they really kind of fell down this league table, and that's remained problematic. After the Brexit vote, we saw community centres being damaged. There were reports of people getting letters saying, go home, stuff being put through people's letterboxes. And that's very unpleasant and doesn't help those Poles who want to integrate to do so. What's the solution to that? Well, one solution to that was that there was a huge campaign which was done, which was better than this, which was run not only for Poles but for all migrant groups, which had kind of major political backing and faith group backing and others, who were kind of leading a systematic effort to try and change that narrative. And I think that was a good campaign. How do you judge success? I mean, do we know that that stopped someone from being racist or being offensive? We don't know that. You can never be able to prove that. But the perceptions of the Polish community was that it had helped in particular places, that the atmosphere changed after that.
Who's going to go next? Quickly. Microphone's coming. Tim, just here. A bit closer, please. Thank you.
Could you just say a little bit more about rights? I think you said on several occasions that rights, that rights is so crucial to the debate, but I'm left not clear about whose rights to do what and where you stand on the various immigrant groups you've talked about earlier. I know you're very anti-economist, and that's fine. So am I. I am one, but I'm anti-economist as well. But say a bit more about rights, please.
Wonderful. Did I see anybody over here? Come on, there's a couple more questions. I know there are a couple more questions out there. Well, we'll do Tim's, and I'll get you to talk to your neighbours.
So one interesting example of that, one of the chapters in this book is by David Goodhart, who is a kind of British political thinker, and his solution, his ethical model after Brexit, is that what we need, according to him, is fewer rights. What we need is to encourage workers to come in on very specific temporary contracts that will last only, and their visa will last only so long as the job does, and then they will go home. And his argument is this is what is needed ethically, because that's the best way of kind of being fair to British people in different communities. That's the fairest thing for other countries, because that will prevent a brain drain. And that is the best sort of economic model for the way forwards. So that's his model. I have reservations about that particular model, but it's an illustrative example of what we're talking about with rights. I mean, there's various rights you could look at, but he's particularly therefore looking at the rights afforded to migrant workers in a place after Brexit. And his argument being that there should be really fairly few of them. I would suggest the opposite. And the reason I would suggest the opposite is that I don't think that the problem which David sees is solved by the solution that he provides. The problem which David sees is that lots of British communities feel undermined, they feel their jobs are taken away, and those are taken away by people who make no effort at integrating, who aren't British, who contribute nothing. I think that his solution makes that worse. Because what it does is it means that you only have people who are taking jobs and not integrating. And therefore, my solution to that would be to go the opposite way and to say that you don't need fewer rights, but more rights, to kind of encourage people to settle and to gain citizenship more quickly, because that way would encourage them to integrate faster. It would encourage having a family life. It would encourage being involved in your local community. It would encourage laying down roots much more quickly. But actually that would ease community tensions about people who just live in ghettos and go to work on the building site and you've never heard them speak English, and that worries people. So that's one example of kind of how rights might play out. Another is around questions of family unification. So, if you immigrate into the UK, you're working here, you've been here for 2 years or so, and then you decide, but actually you like it here, you're settled here, it's a good job, things are going well, you're feeling British, whatever, but you want your wife to join you. And it's usually that way around. It's usually the man that migrates for work, statistically. You want your wife to join you from wherever she is and to bring the kids. The question is, what sort of rights would that entail? Would you be allowed to do that? Would it be possible to bring people over? Or is the rights which you're afforded as a migrant limited to you as an individual who is economically productive? Where your wife and child would not be economically productive and in fact would probably be economically harmful in the sense that they'd be using a school, they'd be using the NHS, etc. So again, there is a debate therefore about what's the kind of right answer to that. And again, I think my argument would be that encouraging that family aspect is part of what makes people human. It's part of their relational being, and that therefore it's an important part of the debate. But there are plenty of other ethical models which would not lead you to that conclusion. So those are some of the rights. But I think you could look at rights in almost any context, in terms of employment, in terms of the right to citizenship, what's the basis, when can you claim a British passport, when can you vote? I think that's a really interesting question. So at the moment, if you're an EU citizen, you can vote in local elections, you can vote in European elections, but you can't vote in the general election, which you might suggest is a bit odd. If you're paying tax, if you're living in a place, this person is representing you and representing your kind of local area, but you don't have any say in that person's election, but you do for other things which affect you locally. We might suggest that's kind of an odd political and rights-based solution to where that person is. In a sense, it would be more logical if you said they couldn't vote at all unless they gained full British citizenship, or if they could vote in everything. But this kind of middle ground is a slight peculiarity, which sort of goes halfway, but not the whole. And what does that mean about what you're expected to do locally?
Great. Wonderful. We're beginning to draw to a close, and you've got one more piece of work to do. I want you to think of one word from what you have heard tonight, or the one that's been going around in your own mind, one word that has struck you, that you want to take away, that you want to mull upon, or that sums up part of Ben's talk, or something that you need to do a bit more thinking about. One word. You've got a minute to talk to your neighbour about a one word that's now going around in your head. It might be multiculturalism, which is the word that's going around in my head. And then Alistair's going to go around with the microphone, and he's got 1 minute to go around as quickly as possible to gather up as many single words that will sum up some of our thinking and our conversation. One word to your neighbour, go. Okay. Alistair's going to have the microphone. I'm going to ask you all to stand up. All please stand up. You're all looking at me. Here we go. All stand up. When you've said your words to Alistair, you can sit down. Okay, so you might want to be putting your hands up very quickly and asking Alistair to come to you. So Alistair, be very alert. And let people give you their one word. That's all you've got to do. You don't have to comment anymore. Just give Alistair your one word. Wave at him, catch his attention, and then you can sit down straight away.
Humanisation.
You're allowed to repeat it.
Blending.
Rights.
People.
Tolerance.
Relationship.
But.
People.
Appreciation.
Rights.
Stewardship.
Delusion.
You can sit down when you've had your word.
Integration.
Neighbours.
Relationality.
Dignity.
Humanisation.
Give me a word.
Behind you.
Integration.
I like this game.
Integration.
Solidarity.
Grace.
Securitization.
Humanization.
Complication.
Nice and loud, please.
We're still going, Gary.
Dignity.
Value.
Asylum seekers.
Dignity. Rights.
Identity.
Human. Compassion.
Morality.
War. Integration.
Ethical. English.
History.
Challenges.
Humanization.
Coming this way. File 2.
Family.
Humanity.
Wonderful. Thank you very... Alistair, did you have one? Microphone. Oh, hang on, one.
Soul.
Soul, yes.
And wine.
Wine, wonderful. So, Ben, I think you can be absolutely assured that they have been fascinated and were absolutely listening to every word that you had to share with us tonight. You've given us a lot to think about, in particular about having frameworks with which to begin to put questions and realize that there are other questions that we've not yet thought about. But in order to be Christian and to make Christian contributions in the world, these are the sorts of questions we need to wrestle with and to continue wrestling with. So, Ben, it's absolutely wonderful to have you with us in advance of the publication of the book. Please do use the opportunity to chat to Ben later on. Can I point you to the collecting plate? And we ask you to give generously to the costs of us holding this series. And can I give you the quick advert for the 7th of June, when the Bishop of Sheffield will be coming. He won't be snowed off. I'm a man of faith and hope. Easter may be cancelled because of the snow, but the 7th of June will not be cancelled. The Bishop will be coming to help us wrestle with the topic of mutual flourishing in a place of real disagreement in the life of the church. What does that have to say to the world? How can we do mutual flourishing in a place of disagreement that has something to say to the world? I think we're all really interested in that. And that date is 7th of June, where? Here. Wonderful. They've got that. Time, 7:30 for a cup of tea, 7:45 for the session, 9:15 for grape juice. So on your behalf, can I say a final thank you to Ben for coming back to All Saints and helping us so clearly with our thinking on this very hot topic of immigration in a post-Brexit, or soon-to-be post-Brexit, post-transitional post-Brexit world. So we give him a big round of applause. Thank you.